Today we will study two great texts of Western intellectual history, Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790, and Mary Wollstonecraft's The Vindications, published in parts as Vindications of the Rights of Men in 1790 and Vindications of the Rights of Women in 1792. First, let me make some rudimentary remarks on these texts before we look at the arguments closely. Edmund Burke's work, Reflections on the Revolution in France, is a classic text in British conservatism. That Burke's text is read even today attests more to the influence his readers' response to the work since its composition. The text argues for the importance of traditions, compromise, and the need to pay due respect to the role of history in politics. The French Revolution forms the main event and idea against which Burke presents his arguments. Burke is not so much against the ideals embodied by the French Revolution as much as the extremism with which it manifested. He maintains that the French Revolution was an event that heightened contradictions and disorders in the French society through an attempt to uproot age-old traditions with no consideration to the consequences such an action entailed. It has been the effect of the revolutionary sense of perfect safety in authorizing treasons, robberies, rapes, assassinations, slaughters, and burnings throughout their harassed lands. All sense of compromise was sacrificed in order to achieve an abstract ideal, liberty and equality. The problem with this form of extremism, Burke points out, is that the liberties and the restrictions vary with times and circumstances and admit to infinite modifications. They cannot be settled upon any abstract rule, and nothing is so foolish as to discuss them upon that principle. Aiming towards an abstract perfection, therefore, becomes practically infeasible. Burkean conservatism does not represent a rigid devotion to one set of ideals over another. Rather, it is an advocacy of moderation and compromise in the achievement of any type of change in societies. Further, this strand of thought warns against the neglect or dramatic uprooting of historical context, traditions, and religious institutions to effect change. The consequences of blind allegiance to abstraction without practical wisdom would lead to the destruction of the very principles of humanity that govern civilized society, and consequently result in the unrestrained reign of chaos. The French Revolution is an example of this outcome. The Vindications is one of the most powerful voices of feminism in the 18th century. Mary Wollstonecraft's work, ironically, was produced in reaction to Edmund Burke's remarks on the French Revolution in his Reflections. While Burke's main thesis did not raise the woman question explicitly, certain of his references, especially those regarding the androgynous fisherwomen and the quaint charms of Marie Antoinette, provoked Wollstonecraft's response. The tract, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, where she argues for the need to better the state of women, is written to the Bishop of Autun, Terryland Perigot, seeking his compassion and favor in the matter. The French Revolution itself, a male-centric vision of freedom, thus stirred the tide of feminist thought. Wollstonecraft posits that women have as much right to improve their lot on earth as men. The tract does not act as a call for political or legal rights for women. Rather, it argues for women's rights to be respected for her mind rather than her physical beauty. My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in the state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. This can happen only when women's minds are educated and cultivated so that she can escape the servile state of obedience and puerility in which she is kept through the institutions of marriage and motherhood. Wollstonecraft appeals to the faculty of reason and disparages romanticism. She underscores that the improvement of a woman's mind will enable her to serve as a better companion, friend, and marriage partner. While it may seem that the goal that Wollstonecraft assigns to women is still marriage and motherhood, and indeed many of the latter day feminists have criticized her for this, this is not the central point of the text. In a time when women had little political voice, the text seeks to gain the support of men who could represent the cause of women. Further, Wollstonecraft's purpose of reforming women is to enable a larger social reform to take place. It is time to effect a revolution in female manners, time to restore to them their lost dignity and make them, as part of the human species, labor by reforming themselves to reform the world. It is time to separate unchangeable morals from local manners. This cannot be achieved, she argues, when half of the human race is kept in servile state with no means to advance their virtues or their mind. In this manner, she combines the woman's cause with the larger cause of social advancement. The text thus, while not an overly political tract, tends towards the direction by urging for the cultivation of greater participation of women in social reform and not simply restricting their movement to the private sphere. Now let's look at these texts more closely.